Okay, cool. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this month's InkWell Poetry Workshop with H.D. Dierdorff. Today's workshop, entitled Elsewhere and Here, an Ecstatic Approach to Ecopolitics, or Ecopoetics, rather, my bad, will explore the question, can poetics of ecstasy through decentering the self move us toward the care and action our current moment requires? Before we begin, I would like to remind all attendees that this workshop is being recorded and will be posted on our county website and social media accounts. By participating in the workshop, you agree to be included in the recording. We will have a question and answer segment after HG's presentation, as well as an opportunity for attendees to create their own poems based on prompts that HG's brought for the event. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can either raise your hand here in the WebEx, just use the raise hand function. I'll be monitoring that. Or you can drop questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the workshop, so that way HG doesn't have to, kind of just be distracted too much by that. But we will be sure to address them, in as timely of a manner as possible. So I would like now to introduce our June InkWell Poet Mentor, H.D. Dierdorff. H.D. Dierdorff is a poet from the Scablands and Pine Savannas of eastern Washington, the ancestral unceded lands of the Spokane people. She is the author of Rain, Wind, Thunder, Fire, Daughter, which was published by the University of Nevada Press in 2024 and was a finalist for the 2026 Oregon Book Award. Their work has been awarded a Vermont Studio Center Fellowship and appeared in journals such as Cutbank, Arkansas International, and Willow Springs. You can currently find them in Portland, where they teach writing at Clackamas Community College and poetry through literary arts. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to HG and we'll get this thing started this morning. Take it away, HG. I'm going to make you a presenter.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Ariel, and thank you all for being here. I am so excited to talk to you all this morning about ecopoetics, which is one of my favorite things. And I've prepared a PowerPoint to kind of guide us through. So let me just go ahead and pull that up here. Okay, I think that looks good. Okay, are you all able to see the PowerPoint? Sorry.
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Ariel. Okay, so to start off, I just want to give you all a brief outline of what we're going to be doing this morning. We'll start off with some writing, have a chance to introduce ourselves, and then we're going to talk about what is eco poetry, what is ecstasy, and then kind of talk about how I am envisioning them working together and what I am tentatively calling an environmental mysticism. We'll have a short break for all of you who, like me, have small bladders and after morning coffee may need to stretch or use the restroom. And then we're going to do some writing together, hopefully get to a small group discussion about our own practices. And like Ariel mentioned, we'll end with a Q&A. Okay, so if you haven't already, please grab your notebooks or whatever you like to write on. And we're going to take 5 minutes to do some writing together. So we have 2 prompts. You can choose either one of them, or if you would like to try and write about both, you are more than welcome. So the first one is, I'd like you to think of a time where you experienced ecstasy, whatever that word means to you. And then describe where you are, what was happening, what did it feel like in your body, and just use as much detail as possible to describe the event. And then secondly, if you would prefer, you can think of a time when you felt connected or disconnected from nature. Again, whatever your definition of that is. where were you, what was happening internally and externally. And then again, I'll just invite you to describe the event in detail, drawing on as many of the five senses as you can. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for 5 minutes. And I'll invite us all to begin writing right about now. Okay, go ahead and finish up whatever sentence you are on. And then I'm going to invite everyone to share briefly your name, something that's brought you joy in the past 2 weeks, and whatever part of your free write that you would like to share, whether that's a sentence or just the idea of it, or if you would love to read the whole thing, that's something we'd love to hear. So I'll go ahead and start us off. My name is H.G. Dierdorff. I also go by Hannah. Something that's brought me joy in the past few weeks is watching my garden start to really take off here as it started to get warmer. Today it's pretty cold in Portland still and rainy, but that has brought me a lot of joy. And yeah, I'll just share the first line of my free write, which is water body, rock body, moss body. And Ariel, if you want to also keep an eye on the chat, if people want to type their answers, that's also awesome, but feel free to just go ahead and popcorn it out and speak whenever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, Natalie shared in the chat a music festival I organized and attended last night. That sounds awesome, Natalie. That sounds really cool. And then a line from her free write, even the strange man in the black polo shirt couldn't ruin my ecstasy. Ooh, I that's like a character now. Now I need to know more about the strange man. That's awesome, Natalie.
Yeah, that sounds like a great start to a short story.
All right. I mean, so go for it, Nisi.
Hi, my name is Nisi, she, they, Nuvie Land, Southern Paiute Land, Las Vegas. Something that's brought joy in the last 2 weeks is, God, it's the end of June already. Both of my daughters had birthdays in the last kind of 2 weeks, June 10th and June 20th. They're like 10 days away from being 10 years apart. So one's 10 and one's 20. So it's a really fun month. A lot of chaos. And then one of the lines that I wrote, it's about one of the parks here on the west side of town. I'm not an outdoorsy type of person, but every spring you'll find me in Gardens Park, 2 rows of trees beginning to wake, blooms sprouting from their leaves like powdered sugar dusting on beignets out of the oven, freshly cooled. I'm hungry.
Yeah, I'm hungry now too. That was beautiful. Thank you, Nisi.
Michael or Winnie, do you all want to go? Or I'm happy to go too, but I want to definitely give you all the opportunity.
Well, I can. My name is Mike Broccoli. Um, I'm going to be selfish. My joy, I'm going to have a book released in late August, early September, my first book. And a local man who's a truck driver and a singer-songwriter in the truck driver culture. Uh, I'm not a truck driver culture guy, but he's a friend of mine. He likes a particular poem of mine from that book, and really wants to promote this book a lot, and is trying to put together a press release. Every time he talks to me, I get excited about my book again. So he's even talking about having me record one of my poems and trying to release it in, I don't even know what he's talking about, trying to release it in some format to make money. And I have to find out if I can even actually do that. Let's see what else. My I wasn't didn't even get to ecstasy yet. Um, talking about a storm. Ice thickened on the power lines and trees. The weight of the ice pulled the wires from their post. They flew across the air like snakes on fire. Um, Talking about a storm that happened when a dog of mine and I moved into my house, and I was amazed at the power of nature.
Thanks for sharing, Mike. Congratulations on your book. That's so exciting.
Thank you.
Winnie said in the chat, I'm in the UK and we're just getting over a heat wave. No air conditioning here. I know, Winnie. Like we keep getting the news stories about how Europe doesn't have air conditioning, which is very confusing to us here in the Southwest. Oh my gosh, I'm glad y'all are surviving. Yesterday I woke up because of a heat headache at 7 a.m. Too early for me. Me too, for a heat headache. But I managed to write a poem in one go while my brain cooled down. That's huge. Like writing through the pain. That's got to bring some joy for sure. That's awesome. Not awesome that you had a heat headache, but awesome that you were still able to create through it. Okay, well, I'll go real quick. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Ariel. I'm the poetry coordinator here in Clark County. Something that brought me joy in the last 2 weeks. My life's been a little crazy, but I will say that we hosted the Juneteenth poetry music event on June 13th this year. We were a little bit early on at Winchester, and that went really well, and it gave me a lot of joy to see our community come out and support it. So that filled my heart. So I was happy. And I don't know if I'm going to share my whole free write here, but I went more so with the second prompt. Hiking to the Weeping Rock Overlook in Zion was a moment when I felt connected to nature. Gratitude for the rain that serendipitously fell as we climbed. Gratitude for my mom being there with me. Overwhelming enough to cut through the grief and hurt I was carrying in my backpack that day. The sight of the rock weeping extra from the rain, the sound of the running water, the smell of the damp vegetation, the fatigue in my legs as I climbed. All catharsis, all fleeting, but all real.
Awesome. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you for sharing your free write. It's a lovely way to have us all start off. So thank you all for sharing, and it's lovely to hear your voices. As a presenter, I'm just like staring at a screen, and because I see the presentation, I can't see your beautiful faces. So it's lovely to hear your voices and know you're out there. So let's go ahead and get started with the presentation part of the workshop. So start us off, what is eco-poetry? I've kind of offered my own definition of eco-poetry, but the truth is eco-poetry has many different definitions. And partially this is because it's still an emerging genre, and partially it's also because eco-poetry itself seeks to kind of push back against this categorization impulse that has defined a lot of the ways that we use language in the Western world. And so eco-poetry isn't really interested in having a set established definition. So it actually encourages people to come up with their own definitions and for that multitude of perspectives to exist, which is one of the things that I love about it. But my take for today, could change tomorrow, is that eco-poetry is a descendant or subgenre of nature poetry that arose out of increasing concerns about climate change and environmental disaster in the late 20th century. It is often multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, so it draws a lot from science, ecology, obviously, poetics, philosophy, history, etc. So, and then we'll continue to talk about this throughout the workshop, but nature poetry is distinct from eco-poetry, and I'm going to attempt to kind of show you that distinction. So nature poetry takes nature as its subject matter, but remains centered on human feelings and interests. And eco-poetry attempts to decenter humans and show how we are part of the environment. So the shift from like nature kind of as mirror to human interests and feelings, to then nature as something that we are part of, and that surrounds us, and that we are only just really a small part of. So I think one of the best ways to visualize nature poetry, eco poetry, environmental poetry, all of these terms, is to really look at the timeline of how and when these literary genres developed. So I have created a timeline here for you all. And you'll see that on the top we have literary history, and the bottom is political and scientific history. I'm not going to go over all of these events, and I'm sure there's so many more I could not fit on this timeline, but I think there's some important things to point out here. So in 1784, we have the invention of the steam engine. And a lot of thinkers kind of trace this back to the beginning of what is known as the Anthropocene. So like this era in geological time where the geological record is so marked by human activity that it becomes like the defining point of how the geological record will be created. And there are arguably different beginnings for the Anthropocene, but 1784, the steam engine, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, really marks the kind of beginning of this acceleration towards human impact on the environment. So something that's really important to point out here is that Romanticism, as a literary genre, evolved simultaneously to the Industrial Revolution. So when we think of nature poems, oftentimes we think of Shelley, Wordsworth, Keats, these great romantic poets who wrote pastorals, and they are trying to escape, the smog of the Industrial Revolution in cities, in England and elsewhere, by escaping to the countryside and kind of glorifying this return to nature as a return to like the divine and the essence of living. So it is exactly as humans begin to really destroy their environment that we begin to have this impulse towards kind of revering it, right? And we see this pattern over and over again in human history, unfortunately. All of this is happening simultaneously with continued enslavement, colonialism, and the project of empire, which really you can't separate the Industrial Revolution from these projects, and you also can't separate the literary history from these projects that are happening that are actively altering the world and human relationships to their environment. And simultaneously, as we begin to witness these forms of destruction, there's also this impulse towards to preserve and really kind of glorify the natural environment. So jumping ahead, obviously there's a lot that goes on in this timeline, but really the shift here from a romantic, idealized portrait of nature as this God-given kind of pastoral landscape, which men should go out and kind of see God's image in, this idea of nature as mirror, to then like an idea of nature as existing in its own right. Obviously, this has to do with a lot of shifts in science. So in 1859, we have Darwin publish The Origin of Species. And 1866, the term ecology is born. 1872, Yellowstone becomes a national park. And we have the starting of the Sierra Club, John Muir, and really the conservationist movement begins around this time. And so this is, rather than seeing like this kind of spiritual side of nature, which the romantics are really interested in, this begins to shift towards nature as material. So nature as like physical matter. And conservationism really believed that we can conserve nature and that can exist alongside the project of capitalism. So a lot of conservationism was protecting lands so actually we could continue to log them. And it is around this time that, like, I would say nature poetry really is solidified, especially in the American consciousness. Robert Frost, classic American nature poet. We have a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, published in 1949. And this is really where the shift becomes between conservationism and preservationism. So again, conservationism believes capitalism can exist alongside this desire to preserve our environmental resources. It's really still thinking of the environment as a resource for humans. But, you know, post-World Wars and like first nuclear explosion in 1945, there becomes this huge shift in thinking. And Aldo Leopold really, with a Sound County Almanac, begins to usher in this new kind of thinking where the environment exists for itself and not just for human interest. And this is what we call like the preservationist era. So this idea that nature should be preserved, untouched, kept over here pristine, like, you know, leave no trace. All of that kind of ethos of putting nature in like a little glass bauble and making sure that it's safe from human impact comes from the preservationist era. And this, again, this is simultaneously happening as plastics start to be produced, as globalization changes the face of the world, and pesticides. You know, 1962, we have the publication of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, bringing awareness to DDT and how that's impacting the insects and birds. And simultaneously, we have the creation of the EPA, right, Environmental Protection Association. So it is as you're constantly continuing to invent new ways to destroy the earth that we are then simultaneously having these counter movements and pulses to preserve, right? And some writers associated with this time, Gary Snyder, W.S. Merwin, Wendell Berry, all I would say are environmental poets. And that's because they have a concern for how human activity is impacting the environment, which makes them kind of distinct from nature poetry. And Mary Oliver, although she lived during this time, I would say is firmly a nature poet, and we'll talk more about that. But then really the shift towards eco-poetry comes at the end of the 20th century as we have the coinage of the term Anthropocene in 2000. And then 2001, Jonathan Skinner publishes his journal, Ecopolitics, coining that term. And this, of course, comes out of this turn again in science towards seeing humans as part of nature and part of the environment instead of separate from it. And it's this also continuing self-awareness of how human activity is causing climate change, and how all our lives are intrinsically caught up in these webs of extraction and really violence against other humans and against the earth. Yes, so that kind of brings us to where we are today with a lot of knowledge about how our actions are harming the earth, but still, sadly, unfortunately, very few ways forward in political action to kind of change the ways that things are running. Okay, so to kind of solidify this difference, I want to talk about a poem called Fox by Mary Oliver, which I would see as a classic example of a nature poem. So in this poem, we see that the speaker is observing the fox, and kind of wondering over its beauty. There's a lot of descriptions, and then there's a lot of descriptions also of the speaker's internal state. So it is this kind of observation of nature which then leads to a transformative experience and knowledge of self in the speaker of the poem. So nature poetry is often written in the first person. It is solidly in the lyric tradition often. It engages with the natural world, but mostly as a way to glean knowledge of self and metaphysics. So the criticisms of nature poetry, and this is kind of where eco-poetry is a reaction to nature poetry, is that it is too idealized or romantic. It doesn't really have any awareness of the context of where this fox is existing. We don't see how this fox's life is being influenced by development and access to water and climate change, all of these concerns. And there's really an editing out of the human. So we don't see how the human actually impacts the fox, whether the fox is even aware of the human, whether the fox is disturbed by the human, or even like where this is taking place. Like, are we just in the middle of a forest? Are we on the edge of a suburban area? All of that is kind of edited out to create this almost mystical portrayal of the relationship between the speaker and the fox. So then eco-poetry, kind of from these criticisms of nature poetry, develops a different set of concerns. So this poem, Agents Orange, Yellow, and Red by Adam Dickinson, traces the ways that these chemicals show up in water and in our bodies, and the kind of violent rhetoric that accompanies this thinking, whether it's very binary. And this is the whole entire logic of war, and where a lot of these chemicals that we use on the environment were first created was for the machine of war, right? So eco-poetry shows humans' footprint and cost in the natural world. There's a lot of self-conscious awareness of one's own involvement in environmental destruction, because at this point, none of us can have entirely like pure lives, right? Where none of our actions, none of the things that we buy, everything we buy is somehow tied to some kind of slow or even accidental or purposeful violence towards the environment. And then nature itself is questioned as a category. So I could go, there's a whole another ecofeminist bent into questioning the binaries between human and nature and man and woman that we could go into here. But basically, we begin to question, okay, well, really, where is nature? What is nature? What do we mean when we say nature? Are humans a part of nature? What about an object like plastic, like a plastic pen that once was, right, a fossil fuel? It once was some part of a living, breathing being, but is now not. Is that a part of nature? So eco-poetry really begins to ask these questions and challenges the way that we use language to talk about nature. It is concerned a lot with catastrophe and involves a lot of research and what is known as docupoetics, because no one knows this stuff off the top of their head. And is really concerned with advocating for environmental justice issues. So these are some of the concerns that we have when we get to eco-poetry. Yeah, I'll just go past this. This is just a summary of what I've already said. Okay, so that's eco-poetry. And so how in the world does that relate to ecstasy? We will get to that in a little bit. But what is ecstasy? This is one of those terms that we use a lot without really knowing where it comes from or even necessarily being able to explain what we mean. But ecstasy comes from the Greek ecstasis, which means entrancement, astonishment, insanity, any displacement or removal from the proper place. We relate ecstasy to elation, rapture, and madness. And it has a huge overlap with mysticism and mystical saints from all different traditions, all different religions, where these writers write of a state of rapture that stupefies the body while the soul contemplates divine things. So again, this idea of being taken up with a contemplation of something greater than yourself and feeling like you are removed from your body is also often related to the erotic, right? And it is a paradox. It is both embodiment, can be a deep pleasure or pain, and is also transcendence from the body. So this is why it often evolves or comes out of things like erotic actions, or oftentimes the mystics have certain bodily routines or repetitions, like the whirling dervishes is part of the Sufi tradition of Islam, where they use their bodies to actually escape their bodies. So part of the paradox of ecstasy is that you're trying to go deeper into the body to actually feel like you escape the body. And I like to talk about ecstasy also as a place beyond language, meaning to like stand elsewhere. Oh, it said screen share is stopped. Is that
Mhm.
okay? Ariel, I can't hear you.
Oh, you might just need to reshare. Yeah, it went away for some reason. I'm not exactly
Okay.
sure.
I will go.
You're still set up as the presenter, so you should be able to share. Again, maybe the window just crashed.
Okay.
Maybe. Hopefully, that's all. There we go.
Yay. Okay.
So weird. I don't know. Like, technology is both amazing because it allows us to like connect with folks literally all across the world for this, but also technology is the bane of our existence. It is both. Anyway.
It's so true. So true. Okay. So, and a lot of the thinking that I've done around ecstasy comes from this book, Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson. And while Anne Carson is specifically examining Eros and how that functions in Greek poetry, inspired by a line of verse that she translated from the Greek from the poet Sappho, who is kind of like the mythical starter of the what is known in Western poetry as the lyric poem, because she would sing poems to her female lovers and play the lyre as she sang. So Anne Carson translates some lines of verse from Sappho and then uses them to begin a meditation on the erotic. And from her kind of meditation on this Greek concept of eros, she develops a triangular kind of system of understanding how the erotic works. And I would argue too how ecstasy works. So just a quote from her book: for where eros is lack, its activation calls for three structural components. We have the lover, the beloved, and that which comes between them. So I've named this the obstacle. They are 3 points of transformation on a circuit of possible relationship, electrified by desire, so that they touch, not touching. And this triangulation is all about reaching, right? And it's all about crossing boundaries. So the desire that is inherent in Eros is the desire to cross a boundary between the lover and the beloved, right? Whatever that obstacle is. Even if it's just the fact that we are individually different beings and there's always going to exist some space between us. And ecstasy is also similarly interested in that reach towards something that cannot fully be comprehended or touched. So there are some different ways that I have also been thinking about this. We could even argue that the act of reading itself is an ecstatic experience because the reader is trying to reach across this boundary towards the writer to understand what they're saying. And the boundary is both one that's physical and time bound, but is also one based on comprehension of the text. So the text acts as both that which connects the reader and the writer, and that which can come between them and confuse the relationship between them. Paul Valery stated, "A poet's function is not to experience a poetic state, but to inspire it in others." And this is kind of the foundation of Apoetics of Ecstasy, this idea that the writer's primary object should be to inculcate an ecstatic experience in the reader, to kind of like transport them as they're reading into some kind of exalted state or feeling of being elsewhere. And going back again to the mystics, this is often how the mystics would speak of their relationship to the divine. So they really thought of the soul as trying to reach toward God or the divine, something which is ineffable, which human language naturally cannot contain. And this is the foundation of apophatic theology, which is the idea that you cannot actually name God in positive statements. You can only name God through negative statements. So you can only say what God is not. And this theology influenced the poet Mary Shebist, who is a Portland local where I live, when she wrote her poem, How Not to Speak of God. You can see that she arranged her lines all radiating out of this empty center. Again, this idea that language is kind of circumnavigating, trying to reach towards this thing that ultimately cannot touch or comprehend. And this is an ecstatic experience. This attempt to reach for something that is beyond us creates an ecstatic space where we are simultaneously full of the rapture of the reach and also full of the grief of the lack that is kind of inherent in the reach of reaching towards something that we cannot fully possess. Okay, so how do these come together? What in the world does eco poetry have to do with ecstasy? So I kind of set out with some questions as I was beginning to write my book years ago. And these were kind of like the tensions that I held in my mind as I was thinking about language and the use of language in poetry. So whereas Poetics of Ecstasy is interested in using language to transport the reader elsewhere, to a place beyond the limits of language, eco poetry is really aware of the limits of language and is really self-conscious about the fact that we have used language for years, especially as part of the foundation of this nation, as a way to destroy the environment, as a way to impose violence upon Indigenous peoples. And so it is constantly, eco poetry is constantly running up against the failures and limitations of language. And then again, the Poetics of Ecstasy is interested in dissolving the boundaries between the perceiver and the perceived, so between the lover and the beloved, as to cross that distance of desire, as Carson says. And when we are writing nature poetry, right, when the thing being perceived is nature, this can sometimes lead to an unself-conscious anthropocentrism, where the boundary between the poet and the nature that they're looking at becomes conflated. And suddenly, when we're talking about nature, we're actually talking about human feelings and ideas instead of recognizing the ways in which nature exists as its own distinct being. And again, eco poetry here contradicts this move by calling us to pay attention to the material networks. So, calling us to pay attention to the ways in which our lives and our bodies are caught up in these networks of creation and destruction. And there's really a focus on place, on paying attention to where you are, knowing, where does your water come from? Where does your trash and sewer go? Like, where do you get your food from? Who created your food? Almost in a kind of like a Marxist lens of being really interested in the labor and the production of material goods and tracing those networks to be able to understand, again, how we are participating in this enormous global network of consumption and production. And all of that makes it really focused on what's here, like what's in front of you. What is this material pen? Where did the pen materially come from? Instead of trying to transport us elsewhere. So perhaps it was an ill-conceived project for me to try to attempt to combine eco poetry and ecstasy, but my mind is stubborn, and there was something that I wanted to preserve about the ecstatic experience of reading poets like Mary Oliver while I began to write eco poetry. So I attempted to understand how an ecstatic approach to eco poetry might work. And I first, in order to do that, had to understand where nature poetry perhaps was not painting the entire picture, or at least where I think it wasn't serving the purpose that I wanted my poetry to serve here in the 21st century, where I can't really close my eyes to like the machine that is on the edge of the fox's environment. So I'm just going to go ahead and briefly read this poem out loud because I believe it deserves reading out loud. So again, we're returning to Fox by Mary Oliver. You don't ever know where a sentence will take you, depending on its role and fold. I was walking over the dunes when I saw the red fox asleep under the green branches of the pine. It flared up in the sweet order of its being, the tail that was over the muzzle, lifting in airy amazement, and the fire of the eyes followed, and the prickled ears, and the thin barrel body, and the 4 athletic legs, and their black stockings. And it came to me how the polish of the world changes everything. I was hot, I was cold, I was almost dead of delight. Of course, the mind keeps cool in its hidden place. Yes, the mind takes a long time. It is otherwise occupied than by happiness and deep breathing. Still, at last, it comes to, running like a wild thing to be taken with its twin sister, breath. So I stood on the pale peach-colored sand, watching the fox as it opened like a flower, and I began softly to pick among the vast assortment of words that it should run again and again across the page, that you again and again should shiver with praise. So this is a beautiful example of what I would call a mystical nature poem. And you will see the mystical, ecstatic elements in the contradictions that the poet places in their experience of this moment. I was hot, I was cold. We have that paradox. I was almost dead of delight. Again, simultaneously something being like dead and also being caught up in rapturous delight. This paradox of existing in 2 places at once that occurs with ecstasy. But what I really love about this poem is that the poet is very intentionally telling you how she is forming language in order to mimic her own experience by evoking an ecstatic experience in the reader. And this is where I would say this is an ecstatic nature poem because the poet, again, is reaching towards nature using language as a way to feel that gap between her and the fox close until they are, in her mind, experiencing this moment of delight and transcendence together. And you could even, in this triangle, replace poet with reader, right? Because this is what the poet is interested in doing, is using language to connect the reader with this vision of nature and experience together this moment of transcendence and removal. So if that's what an ecstatic nature poem looks like, what would an ecstatic eco poem look like? And here are some of the questions that I was thinking about. So how can we write about loss and destruction without nullifying moments of ecstatic connection and transformation? So how can I simultaneously want to feel this connection with the fox and also recognize that as part of the human species, my actions have negatively affected the fox and its habitat and its chance of life? How can we hold together suffering and beauty, anger and love? The poetics of ecstasy that I'm interested in is one that recognizes its own limitations, that questions its own ethics, that calls us to momentarily stand beside ourselves so that we may return to our lives with greater commitment and care. What is the role of ecstasy in an environmental crisis? And you could also say a political crisis, because I believe the two are inexorably entwined. Can ecstatic experiences through decentering the self move us toward the responsibility, care, and action our current moment requires? So is it possible to transcend a boundary and limitation and move outside the self, move elsewhere, and then also simultaneously that movement allows us to return to our own lives, to return to the here with greater commitment and care? And this is what I tried to imagine as the project of the ecstatic eco poem. And we'll continue to explore that by looking at a few different examples of eco poems. So what does desire look like through an eco-critical lens? What does ecstasy look like through an eco-critical lens? And I think one answer to that is the poem In the Fields by Jake Skeets, which can be found in his book, Eyes Bottle Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers. And this poem is too beautiful not to be read, so I'm going to read it for you all. In the Fields. I palpate his chest, a tome, with skin like milk, bare-hued. Fingers hum across my forehead into a number, his eyes bloodshot and flaxen from the lamplight. My tongue runs across his shoulders, stone bells affixed to bone. Cathedral noise in the socket, a rotten lisp. Pipelines entrenched behind his teeth. I hear a crack in his lung like burning coal. I hear his lips kissing mine as a sermon. My pelvis daisies as he chants my body back to weeds. One day he'll forget about wounds, lower himself too into bellflower. So in this poem, there's a lot of ways that the metaphorical language is creating different triangles of relationships. And you'll notice that there is a lot of allusion to religious imagery here. It stopped again. Okay. I will do it again.
It is what it is. It's all
It
good.
is what it is. It's okay. Repetition is part of the ecstatic process. So we are just putting into action. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so there is religious language, religious metaphors relating to the body of the lover, and there's also language about fossil fuels related to the body of the lover. And Jake Skeets, for context, is Indigenous, and he writes a lot about queerness and being gay and the relationship to earth and violence that comes as part of being a queer Indigenous person in the United States. So the triangulation here, I mean, I think these are several different triangles you could draw, but one potential triangle, ecstatic triangle, is between the body, the earth, and fossil fuels. And the body here is conflated because the speaker's body becomes bellflower, becomes a part of the earth through this act of erotic connection with his lover, but his lover's body is the one that is resisting this transformation into Earth, right? It is the one that is haunted by the religious history of natives being indoctrinated, right? And it's haunted by the fossil fuels that are destroying the Earth. So there is this tension here between knowledge of the violence that separates the body and the Earth, and also by naming it, the poet attempts to cross that boundary and to bring together all three into a moment of ecstasy. Another example of how ecstasy works is found in Shade is a Place, which is a recent poetry collection published by Micaiah Tolbert. And Shade is a Place, an Urgent Need. Their poem talks about how Micaiah was commissioned by the Tree Commission in Charlottesville to lead tree walks around the city, because Charlottesville has a huge problem with trees dying, and the lack of trees becomes an environmental issue, right? Because we're talking about shade and we're talking about relief from heat, also beauty and access to the environment, and who has that. And so Micaiah's work really interrogates the history of environmental racism and the ways that redlining has created in Charlottesville these pockets of neighborhoods where people of color don't have access to shade and don't have trees, and that is only being exacerbated as stress on the trees from climate change and from different diseases continue to kind of weed out the trees, and eventually a lot of the trees in the town actually are really kind of all going to die pretty soon. So that's a lot of what her work is interrogating. And as a Black person, she's really interested in how racism and the history of racism in the United States is related to her relationship to the trees and her relationship to place, which places can be places of comfort and rest and refuge, which is what shade is. Another possible ecstatic erotic triangulation happens in Extra Hidden Life Among the Days, which is both the title of this poem and the title of the collection in which it appears by Brenda Hillman. And this entire collection deals with primarily lichens and a way of conversing with lichens as this species, as this really lichen is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and algae. So it's not even necessarily its own a being, it's a being that exists through relationship, and it exists at these edges of things, right? It exists in the precarious, and is often like an indicator species of the health of an entire ecosystem. So she's conversing with these lichens, and particularly in this poem, she's talking to extremophiles, which are different beings that thrive in extreme environments, like within a volcano. And she is interrogating how these beings that exist in extremely harsh conditions kind of offer her a vision for what life could look like after humans may be gone. And I'm just going to go ahead and read the final lines of this poem, just because I love it so much. The living prefer life, mostly they do. They're ravenous, making shapes and groups as the dying grow. One thought until the end, wanting more specifics, desert or delay until the eye drops away into I am not here. The mineral other pumps and vast vapors, ridges and shadows beyond, the single life it had not thought of. So here, the ecstatic impulse to transcend the self, right, becomes this movement, a generous movement of Hellman imagining life and beauty beyond the eye, beyond like the individuality of the human species. And in this way, she is able to imagine a future for the earth and like a future for nature beyond the destruction that we are imposing onto our planet. I think this is the last poem I have. I had so many, so I really had to limit myself. But kind of like a last example of an ecstatic eco poem is Chorus 4, Elsewise, by Daniela Naomi Molnar, which appears in her book Chorus, which I highly recommend. And the ecstasy here actually appears in this triangulation between the consciousness, the poet's body, and the knowledge of slow violence. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this poem as well. If I can look this morning at my eyes, what does the rest, elsewise, have to do? Metronome beat of rain and drain pipe, creamy dogwood bracts pointing all 4 directions, morning dove, morning, in the zinc bright rain, a heron flies to the city's last swamp. I've noticed how many good hearts have to stop to keep me clothed and fed. I've noticed the calluses on other hands, the splinters and paw pads, the burrs and black feathers that, elsewise, ought to fly. Weighted ends of the baton filled with viscous glitter gel that I used to twirl up and down the hot driveway, a march, a weft, to weave the spinning. Where's the baton now? Cracked plastic, glitter gel, oozes into ocean floor or smears into chemical heat in some foreign dump where brown children I'll never elsewise meet walk orbits for what might pay, what might clothe and feed. I've noticed chatty atoms can sustain or kill, and there seems to be no will involved, no ethics or polarity, no gauge. I've no grip on that war. So far, today, I've noticed how a nation can turn its weapons on itself. Like I could choose to crush my toe bones to dust or hole punch my eyes just by looking. Standing in the kitchen, eating toast, I tell myself I'm harmless. I only want what I don't have. So here, Molnar is interrogating the nature of desire itself, right? And also the relationship between herself and her body, this kind of like split consciousness from her body where she is unable to look herself in her own eyes. She's trying to look herself into her own eyes and acknowledge the ways in which her life is caught up in these acts of slow violence against other people on the planet. But it is a movement, it is a reach that she must return to again and again because it is one that is extremely uncomfortable, right? It's extremely uncomfortable to look yourself in the eye and be honest about the ways in which your own fact of living is participating in harm. Okay, so here, although you can see there are many different ways of approaching writing an ecstatic eco poem, I think my current definition of what an ecstatic approach to eco poetry looks like, I have defined by the relationship of the reader to the poem. So a poem that inspires its reader to desire connection with a part of the earth, nature, even another human being, right? It must also name and reveal the violences that are currently harming that relationship. So even a poem about a lover, you know, driving across the country to visit their beloved, right? An ecstatic approach to that eco poem would both name the desire and longing that moves this person physically in their car to drive the hours to see their beloved, but also would name the fossil fuels, right? And the impact on the environment that are a part of this move, a part of this transportation, the material realities of this transportation of the distance of desire. Okay. So how does that really relate to responsibility and care? The poet Kyle Dargan has talked about how responsibility can be a kind of ecstasy because it removes certain effects or affectations. And I think for what I've been thinking about is the ways that liberalism, and particularly white liberalism, has this affectation of moral purity, right? This idea that we have the right answers, we're on the right side of history. And because of that, there is, I think, in our current moment, a lot of paralysis about what actions to take because there are no pure actions. And I think partially the movements I'm interested in are this removal, this pretense of purity, and this pretense that it is possible to have the perfect language. And so I think ecstatic eco poetry is interesting to me because it invites language to fail. So it crosses the boundary of language sometimes, but it also really points out the distance between the two, the distance between this desire for union with the earth and the reality of our material relationships. This, which I think can be applied to a lot of our desires for the world around us. And there's a lot of grief and rage because I think a lot of us have grown up, or at least I actually should only speak for myself, but like growing up within a kind of like conservative Christian tradition in the American West, I was taught that language can save. And this is kind of also the history of this nation is built upon these Protestant movements that firmly believe that you are saved by language, saved by confessing a certain creed or doctrine. And I think eco poetry invites us to constantly play with the possibilities of language and, yes, utilize its power, but also recognize that it is not ultimately able to save us. And instead, we are accountable for our actions. And this kind of grief that comes up with this, I think, can be really decentering because it may require us to lose a lot of our own identities or like own ideas of ourselves. But I think that decentering is really also an opportunity to reimagine what our lives could look like if we abandon these illusions of control and independence, and instead pay attention to like what is here in front of us. Okay, that was a lot of talking. I'm going to invite us all to take a 5-minute break and return here at 11:20, prepared to do some writing. Okay, welcome back from our short break. I'm just gonna take a second and make sure people are back. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the second half of our time together. So this is the time for you all to do some writing. So go ahead and return to your notebook or wherever you wrote your morning pages. And you'll want several different sheets of paper because we'll be doing this as a kind of like staggered writing prompt. So the first step is going to be to return to your morning pages and circle all of your favorite words, phrases, or sentences. So these could just be really words that are really strong, emotionally moving, or descriptive, or just words that you like. Doesn't have to be a particular reason. And then I'm going to invite you to rewrite these words on a new page. So make sure to leave plenty of blank space around each word or phrase because you're going to be writing around them in the next step. But I'm just going to go ahead and set our timer for 5 minutes and invite you to circle your favorite words from your morning pages and then rewrite them on a new page.
HD, it did stop sharing again for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
Oh, thanks for letting me know.
No worries. It's not a big deal. I don't know what's happening with. I'm going to blame it on WebEx.
Seems like a likely culprit. Okay, go ahead and get that last word or phrase down on the page if you're finishing up, and then we're going to move on to the next step in our writing prompt. So now I'm going to invite you to look at your words or phrases or sentences that you just wrote down on your page one at a time, and write down all of the words that you associate with that word or phrase. So try not to think too hard and just write down what immediately comes to mind. It doesn't have to relate to any of the things we've been talking about, or even it doesn't have to even relate to the thing that you were trying to originally write about. Let your brain go in whatever direction it wants. However weird, the idea here is to let yourself kind of tap into the unconscious. So we're going to do this for 10 minutes. And I'll let you all know when we have about 2 minutes left. But right now we're just focusing on creating kind of like a word bank. So just try to get as many words as you can down on the page.
Thank you for joining us, Natalie. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Yeah, absolutely. Look for the recording. It'll probably be up sometime next week on our YouTube page. So go ahead and follow along, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Okay, I have about 2 minutes left. Okay, go ahead and finish whatever word phrase you're writing down. Hopefully you've got a good bank of words to draw from. And the next step in our prompt is going to be thinking about the third point in our triangle. So on a new page, I'm going to invite you to imagine the human activity and material histories behind the experience you described for your morning pages. So for example, if you wrote about walking through a forest, you could imagine the history of settler colonialism, logging, land management, fire suppression, development, drought, how human-caused climate change is impacting the forest, etc. So again, think of this as a third point in your ecstatic triangle, thinking of the reader, your portrayal of nature or like ecstatic connection that you're wanting to move the reader towards, and then the third point in your triangle being that awareness of human activity and how it is both connecting and also blocking that reach of desire. Feel free to, oh, it stopped again. Feel free to look things up on the internet. It's a great resource. I use it all the time in our writing, but I would encourage you to, like, if you can, not use the AI answers, or sometimes I just search and do minus AI, just because there's a lot of reasons for that. If you haven't heard of it, I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to watch The Ghost in the Machine, which is a new documentary by Valerie Viach. I don't know how to say her last name, but it kind of tracks the history of AI and makes an argument for its roots in eugenics. But in this conversation, in this workshop, thinking about environmental impacts, AI, bad, not news to most of you, I'm sure. But yeah, go ahead and start your writing. We will take 5 minutes for this, and then see where we're at. Okay, about 1 minute left. Okay, go ahead and stop wherever you're at. And here is one last step. We're gonna start composing it, but I know that we want to leave some time for a Q&A. So Ariel, would it be okay if we just do this for 5 minutes, then leave about 10 for Q&A?
Yeah, of course. Or we could flip that around and do 10 minutes on one side, 5 minutes for Q&A. It doesn't have to be a long process, whatever you prefer.
Okay. Yeah, since there's not a ton of us, assuming there's not going to be a ton of Q&A. So let's go ahead and use the time for writing because, as everyone knows, that is precious and not easily had sometimes in our lives. So the last steps to this writing activity, you have now hopefully created 2 different pages of word banks. And I'd invite you to once again circle your favorite words, phrases, or sentences from these word banks that you have just created. And then you can begin to draft a poem using these words. And I'd invite you to pay attention to the tension between that experience of connection or ecstasy, that reach, and also your knowledge of violence, whether slow or incidental, that forms the material relationships. So play around with moving around order of the words, not writing complete sentences, not using punctuation. Yeah, have fun, play with it. We will write for about, see, so now 11:47. So let's just write for 8 minutes and see where we get, and we'll leave 5 minutes for some Q&A at the end. Okay, you got about 1 minute left. Okay, go ahead and finish wherever you were at. And then, oop, we did not get to the small group discussion, sadly.
That's okay. That just means maybe we need to have an elsewhere in here part two at some other point. It's something we've actually run into with a lot of our workshops where, we kind of decide like, hey, it would be cool to do a part two of this maybe next year. So that's something we can, ooh, I like the graffiti. The trees will remember. It makes me think of like the Ents in Lord of the Rings or something. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a big Tolkien head. No, so I guess kind of like last thing here, I do like to open it up for questions. So first off, anyone in attendance here, Winnie, Nisi, Michael, y'all are who've stuck with us through the end here. Do any of y'all have any questions for HG before I kind of let them plug their pluggables and we roll out here? Speak up.
I have a question. Um, so when like the entire concept of like ecstasy and ecopoetics, I really love this. Um, because I find that it's almost impossible for me to write about um about the environment without immediately getting into a rage every single time. Um, and it's out of love, right? For the environment, for the earth and everything. But I think that how you've kind of like brought this structure of bringing ecstasy and positivity and love into it um, it's just mind blowing. And so my question is, did you run into this when you first started writing about like ecopoetics, and how did you is there anything specific that helped you kind of get out of that mind frame of just focusing on the negative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to encourage you that rage is a really powerful response. And actually, I wrote most of my book out of anger. Um, and I think that you're exactly right that anger and love actually are, anger is letting us know that something that we love is threatened. And that's a really important emotion to feel. And also, I think it's not even adverse to ecstasy. It's not even negative. I think there is something called like a negative ecstasy in the sense of which feels really dissociative to me, like a grief or a rage. These like more emotions that we associate with negativity, but which maybe just more difficult to feel, especially because they're not very socially acceptable. That can be powerful to transport us elsewhere. So I would say that rage actually can feed ecstasy, and that those things all exist together. And I just like encourage you to let all of your rage and love exist together because that's really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like love and rage can both lead to catharsis, which is a kind of ecstasy, or can be a kind of ecstatic experience. No, it's really cool. I'll just say HG, I have 3 degrees in literature, so I really appreciated the literary history with like mixed in with like the political history stuff. Like I loved all the context you gave for this frame of the narrative, this frame of like how do we kind of use these tools, use this frame to create more interesting poetry. So I just want to thank you for that. So last but not least here, HG, did you want to share with anyone kind of stuff you have coming up, where folks can follow along with you, where you want them to connect with you, if you want them to connect with you?
Yeah, I will confess I am very offline, so that is a part of my practice.
love
But
that.
please reach out if you would like. I think the best way to reach me is by email. You can find that on my website, hgdierdorff.com. And in fact, my email is just hannahdierdorff@gmail.com. So very easy to access. I'm always delighted to receive emails about poetry. I'm mostly teaching writing composition right now, so any opportunity to talk about poetry is a delight. I do not have anything coming up immediately right now. I've been in a season of figuring out employment for the past few years and stability and how to be a working teacher and writer. So hoping to do a lot of more writing on a second manuscript this summer, but nothing staged to be released yet.
Always the Sisyphean task of the next project.
Yeah.
I completely understand. All right, y'all. I did drop HG's website link in the chat, so if you want to grab that before we roll out here. But other than that, I just want to say thank you, HG, on behalf of Clark County Public Arts. You've been a wonderful poet mentor for us. Thank you all for attending, and follow along. I completely wish we could be completely offline. Trust me, my heart is offline. But if you want to follow along and kind of see poetry stuff or just general public art stuff coming up here in Clark County over the next few months here, if you're not already, follow CC Public Arts on Instagram. That's the easiest way to get connected. And I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your Saturday, and we'll see y'all next month. Thanks, y'all.
All right, thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.